Hello, everyone. I hope your day is starting off as fantastic as it possibly can. If I start talking about economics and politics, is it going to ruin your day? Behind me is our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who has said that his number one priority in governing the nation is to focus on the economy. And I'm sure that we all hope he makes good decisions and leads our economy into growth and prosperity. Now, unfortunately, as prime ministers make decisions and implement policy and govern, we as citizens swim in a sea of slogans and misinformation. And this is true no matter who the leader of the country is at any given time. We're usually bombarded by the opposition, pointing out what a terrible job they're doing and how all their decisions are wrong. And in recent times, that rhetoric is amplified so much that you actually hear things like, if this particular party wins and this particular person governs, the nation will be destroyed, the very fabric of our society will collapse, and we won't have a country left. The question is, how will the decisions and the policies of any given leader affect the future of our country, and in what shape will we leave our country and our economy for future generations? So I thought it would be a good idea to look back and examine some actual data, and I warn you this will include looking at some graphs, and see how the decisions of past prime ministers have affected our economy and our prosperity. And you might be surprised at what we see. Now, I'm going to stick to examining economic data, okay? Because this is not the History Channel. And I'll start off by just showing you a graph here of Canada's GDP. This is the total value of all goods and services produced in the Canadian economy, way back to 1960. And you can see that the Canadian economy has been growing quite nicely for 60 years, except for a couple of key points on this graph. And I'm going to show them to you and kind of give you an explanation why. And you can see that from 1960, our GDP was growing steadily and in a linear way up till about 2002, at which time it started to grow even faster, except for these specific moments in our history. Going from 2008 to 2009, our GDP actually dropped. Going from 2014 to 2015, our GDP actually dropped. And going from 2019 to 2020, our GDP actually dropped. 3 times it dropped, but other than that, it's been consistently increasing. There's one thing that all 3 of these drops have in common. Let me show you. Here's a graph of oil prices from 1975 to present. And in each of those 3 drops in Canada's GDP, there was a significant drop in oil prices. The first drop in 2008-2009 was triggered by the global financial crisis. The big financial crisis triggered by the impending collapse of the US banking system that was going to take the whole world down, brought on by the collapse in value of all the subprime loan assets that they were carrying on the books. Explaining in detail what happened in 2008 would take a whole video, and there's been movies made about it. But suffice to say, that triggered a big slowdown in the world economy. The economic fallout was felt around the world. But Canada emerged from that crisis relatively unscathed economically. None of our banks went under. There were no huge bailouts required. We didn't have a housing price collapse like the United States did. In some areas, housing prices dropping 50, 60%. But the world uncertainty triggered a collapse in oil prices. Oil fell from $128 in July 2008 abruptly to $34 in February of 2009. And this is US crude price, WTI. Alberta crude trades at a discount to this, and basically cutting off resource revenue from our GDP caused it to drop. In 2015, there was a big drop in oil prices that was brought on by a worldwide slowdown in the economy, and they dropped from about $100 a barrel down to $27. West Texas Intermediate, so Alberta crude, again, trading at single-digit numbers. And 2020 was the year of the pandemic, and oil prices fell down to $15 WTI. And I recall in this case, Alberta heavy oil prices dropping to 0. So 3 different reasons resulting in 3 big drops in oil prices, corresponding to 3 drops in our GDP. Now, there were different economic realities associated with all 3 of those drops, but you can research each one of them and read things like Canada's GDP fell in 2015 primarily primarily due to a sharp decline in oil prices, which led mainly to reduced export sales in the energy sector. And the energy sector represents a big portion of Canada's GDP. So it's really unfair to blame any of those three drops on one particular prime minister. One key takeaway here is that no matter how angry you get or how many new pipelines you build, when you have one of those price shocks and oil prices drop to almost zero, it will affect Canada's GDP in a big way. And for those of you who think Alberta would be better off on its own, those price shocks or extended price shocks like that would result in potentially depression-like conditions for a standalone Alberta economy. The increase in Canada's GDP is very closely linked to our ability to increase exports and what the value of those exports are. So let's look at some numbers in graph form of what prime ministers and governments can actually affect. And behind me is a graph of federal gross debt from 1970 to 2022. And I've taken these graphs and information by an article that was published by the Fraser Institute. And they did some really good work in tabulating all this data. And maybe I'll reference this in the video description below. And they display a graph here of Canada's debt over time, normalized to 2022 dollars, so taking into account inflation. And the colors on the graph represent in red when we had a Liberal government and in blue when we had a Conservative government. Now this is a good graph, but an even better graph is this, our federal gross debt per person, normalized for population growth, because it's not fair to compare 1925 debt versus 2015 debt. The population of the country has changed, so this normalizes for our population growth. Now let's not go all the way back to 1870, but let's start here at 1935, right after the Great Depression, to 1957, and there's a big red spike up and down, and that period encompasses the Second World War. Massive spending and massive increase in debt per person during the Second World War, and then a corresponding decrease after the Second World War. And if you cut out this triangle, you'll see that our debt per person was just increasing at kind of a linear, steady rate here. So who were the prime ministers that were running the country between 1935 and 1957? Well, from 1935 to 1948, it was William Lyon Mackenzie King. And from 1948 to 1957, it was Louis St. Laurent. John Diefenbaker, a Conservative, took over from 1957 to 1963. 1957 to 1963, this narrow blue band here, where federal gross debt per person stayed on a trend here that excludes this spike due to the Second World War. Let's move on to the next prime minister here. Excluding this little blue sliver here, we had a long period of red Liberal government from about 1963 to 1985. A long period of Liberal governments starting with Lester B. Pearson, 1963 to 1968, and then the arrival of Pierre Trudeau, 1968 to 1979, a thin sliver of Joe Clark, Conservative Prime Minister, and then back to Pierre Trudeau, 1980 to 1984. And we happen to have some really good year-over-year data of these periods, and I'll show you the performance, economic performance of these prime ministers. We're not going to talk about social issues or some of the other accomplishments that they may have had. We're going to stick to economics here. Lester Pearson governed from 1963 to 1967, and you can see his economic performance each year relative to spending. When he started in his first year, the deficit was $1.2 billion, and when he finished his term, he left with a $1 billion yearly deficit, fairly stable, a period of stability. The value of the deficits as a percentage of GDP started when he was elected at minus 2.5%, meaning the deficit that year represented 2.5% of the GDP, but the GDP was growing and he managed to keep the deficits stable. And so you see these percentage numbers actually go down. And he had one year of almost a balanced budget. And the graph here shows Canadian deficits and surpluses yearly, the actual numbers being this dark line. The next prime minister was Pierre Trudeau, and this is his first 10 years. When he started, the deficit was under $1 billion. $667 million was our deficit in 1968 when he got elected, representing less than 1% of our GDP. For the next 2 years, 1969 and 1970, the government actually posted a slight surplus and a tiny deficit, almost a balanced budget. But what unfolded between 1971 and 1978 was just a huge increase in our deficit year over year over year. And as a percentage of our GDP, those deficits started getting bigger and bigger and bigger by 1978, representing over 5% of our GDP. In today's terms, that is a disaster number. That's the type of number that the US is dealing with right now. And Moody's rating agency has just downgraded their credit rating. Joe Clark was our prime minister for just a sliver of time there and ran a close to $12 billion deficit, but he really had no time to make any impact. Pierre Trudeau was elected again in 1980 and was the prime minister through 1983. And these numbers can only be described as a disaster. And I'm speaking just economically here, because we saw from the first graph I showed that Canada's GDP was steadily growing over time, except for those 3 dips. So our GDP was growing throughout the terms of all these prime ministers we're going to examine here. But remember, they had control over spending. And under Trudeau, that spending just kept increasing and represented a deficit as he exited of $32.5 billion, representing almost 8% of our GDP at the time. These type of numbers are simply unsustainable. There were other economic policies that he brought forward, like the National Energy Program, which guaranteed that the Liberals would never get another vote in Alberta for the next 50 years. We're not going to discuss all those things in detail because it would take a whole other video, but just from an economic perspective, sustainability of the growth and health of our economy, Trudeau's decade and a half in power were a disaster. And when we go back to this federal gross debt per person, you can see that the initial period here of when Pierre Trudeau was in power, this graph is fairly flat, but then just takes off straight up. And that's this big jump here at the end of his term. Pierre Trudeau was finally defeated and the Conservatives took over, and they have a fairly thick blue band here belonging to Brian Mulroney, who was our prime minister between 1984 and 1993, 9 years. And we're going to skip John Turner because he was only prime minister for this long. Now, one of Brian Mulroney's major accomplishments, and I know I said I wouldn't talk about major accomplishments, but it was related to the economy, was he's the guy that negotiated the first free trade deal with the United States. Brian Mulroney was also the prime minister that gave us the GST when he reworked our whole tax system and eliminated some of the manufacturing taxes and introduced our first consumption tax in Canada, which when he introduced it was 7%. The GST originally was 7% in Canada. But going back to these numbers, over his 9 years as prime minister, he started with a $37 billion deficit, and when he left, $39 billion deficit. No progress really in decreasing the amount of the yearly deficits, but because the GDP was growing as a percentage of GDP, we were starting to drop slightly, but these numbers are all horrible again. In his first year, his first deficit, inheriting an economy from Pierre Trudeau, $37 billion deficit, representing 8% of our GDP. That's a horrible number. And when he left, that number was still stubbornly high, 5.6%. The final deficit of $39 billion. These numbers are all unsustainable. Canada experienced several credit ratings downgrades in the early 1990s, particularly in 1992, 1994, and 1995, when Standard & Poor's downgraded Canada's foreign-dominated government debt to AA- from AAA. This was very bad news, and Canada was on the brink of becoming a failed nation should these downgrades continue. Because as I've explained in other videos, when you have your credit rating decrease like this, the yields on your bonds increase, and it makes it more expensive for you to borrow money. You start paying more and more and more of your budget just servicing your debt, which eventually, if it snowballs, bankrupts your country. And you can see when we go back to this graph again of federal gross debt per person, that during Brian Mulroney's tenure as prime minister, that gross debt per person was just skyrocketing, going straight up. And this was an unsustainable situation. Now let's look at the next band of red here. After Brian Mulroney came Kim Campbell, and she lasted that long. And then we got Jean Chretien, who was our prime minister between 1993 and 2003, followed by Paul Martin from 2003 to 2006. And I'll mention that Paul Martin was Jean Chretien's finance minister. And something magical happened in Canada that has never occurred since. If you look at Jean Chretien's numbers, his first year he posted a $38.5 billion deficit, representing 5.3% of our GDP. And then over the next 3 years, those numbers were pounded down until 1997, when Canada posted a $2.9 billion surplus. Paul Martin became the Liberal government's finance minister in 1993 and was soon convinced that Canada's deficit and debt were unmanageable. On February 27, 1995, he introduced a budget that chopped social programs, unemployment insurance, and transfers to the provinces for healthcare, education, and social assistance. The battle for public opinion was fierce. Martin was famously quoted as saying he would follow through come hell or high water. What followed was 7 unprecedented years in Canadian history where the government posted year after year after year surpluses and actually paid down some of our debt. And those surpluses ranged from 0.3 to almost 2% of our GDP. At the time, economists were talking about Canada being a model for the rest of the world to follow. Paul Martin became our prime minister after Jean Chretien, and he continued for 2 more years of posting surpluses, his last year being a $13.2 billion surplus. Now, I want to really emphasize what a huge effect that had on the Canadian economy. And we go back to this graph of gross debt per person, and you can see that during the Chretien and Paul Martin government period, how that line trends down here on the graph and gets us back onto the regular trend. We climbed off the mountain. And as we were descending off the mountain and our fiscal position was getting better and better and better, look at the graph here, by about 2002, remember this graph from the beginning of the video when our GDP growth was trending and growing at this rate, as I'm displaying behind me here. And then right around 2002, our GDP started accelerating and increasing more rapidly. There's 2 key factors that helped this happen. And number 1 is fixing our fiscal books by Paul Martin and Jean Chretien, really increasing confidence from around the world and making Canada a more attractive place to invest. And number 2 was the free trade deal that Brian Mulroney, the previous Conservative Prime Minister, negotiated with the US, integrating our economies more and making it much easier for us to export to the US and much easier for the US to invest in Canada. Those 2 decisions really helped to turbocharge our economy going forward for decades. And it's really amazing how just 1 or 2 decisions that a prime minister makes can affect the well-being of our country for decades and decades in the future. Then in the next election, Paul Martin was defeated and we elected a new Conservative prime minister, Mr. Stephen Harper, who was our prime minister between 2006 and 2015, a 9-year span. And you can see on this chart that we keep referring to, federal gross debt per person, that the trend that Paul Martin left him continued and then abruptly changed and started to go up again. And Stephen Harper, inheriting 9 years of surpluses, continued that for 2 more years, but very quickly flipped it back into deficits and posted in 2009 what I think was Canada's biggest deficit ever at the time. Now, some of you will recall that 2008 was the year of the financial crisis. It affected the whole world and our GDP went down, as I showed at the beginning. But these numbers are not reflecting just GDP. But a big factor that led to the large jump in deficit was the fact that one of the first things Stephen Harper did when he became prime minister is he lowered the GST. He lowered the GST from 7% to 6% and then right away from 6% to 5%. And it was estimated at the time that a 1% drop in the GST would affect government revenues by $7 billion. So a 2% drop in the GST meant that the government was collecting $14 billion less in taxes. Now, Paul Martin was very critical of Stephen Harper's decision to cut the GST, and he said in an interview in 2008, the Conservative government has no excuse if it goes into a deficit after inheriting a $12 billion surplus from the Liberals just 2 years ago. And warning that Stephen Harper would run deficits in the future, he said, our deficit has not been gutted, not been eviscerated because of the financial crisis, but because the government cut the GST and then embarked on the biggest spending spree in government history. And it is true that Canada fared fairly well and emerged virtually unscathed during the financial crisis in 2008. Yes, our GDP dropped slightly, as it did for all countries in the world, but none of our banks went bankrupt. There were no huge bailouts necessary from the Canadian government to support them. We did not have a housing price collapse like they did in the United States and in other countries in the world. People that were holding large mortgages on newly purchased homes that saw the value of those homes drop by up to 50%, had to declare bankruptcy. That did not happen in Canada. And one of the main reasons is that in the decades before 2008, the US was deregulating their banking system, allowing banks to leverage themselves more and not scrutinizing closely what type of assets their investment branches were holding. In those years during which the United States was deregulating their banking system, the Conservative Party, led by opposition leader Stephen Harper at the time, often stood up in question period and criticized the Chretien government and urged them to also deregulate the Canadian banks. And their reason was, well, the Canadian banks are no longer competitive. The US banks are making so much more money and they are so much more competitive in the global economy. We should deregulate our banks so that we can compete with them. And a wily Jean Chretien, even in recent interviews when he's asked, what were some of your best decisions that you made as Prime Minister, says things like, well, there were two things that I think I did pretty good. I did not listen to Mr. Bush when he talked about going to Iraq to find those weapons that were massively destructive. I did not believe him, so I did not go. And I did not listen to Mr. Harper when he urged me to deregulate Canadian Bank. So I think I did pretty good, Sometimes when you play hockey, you have to pass the puck, and sometimes you have to shoot. So I think I did pretty good. That was pretty good, right? That was pretty good. And that taxation shortfall happened immediately, and the economic benefits of dropping the GST would happen over time and are still being debated as to whether it was a good idea to do or not. His policy was a complete flip from Brian Mulroney's policy. He's the guy that introduced the GST and argued, and was supported by many economists, that a consumption tax would be a much better tax for the economy, and that the plan should be to eventually lower income taxes, and that the GST could just be left at a constant level. And as the economy grows, taxation would increase. But anyway, he lowered the GST 2 percentage points, and that basically gave him a minus 14 billion every year in revenues. And you can see the last couple of years here where he posted 18.9 billion and 16.6 billion in deficit. That would have been almost a balanced budget had the GST not been dropped. And in today's numbers, and I know, guys, everyone hates taxes, okay? But I'm just talking about numbers. This is just math now. In today's numbers, in 2025, a 1 percentage point in GST revenue, it represents a much bigger number now than it did back in 2007. So Stephen Harper entered with a $13.8 billion surplus and left with a $26 billion deficit. Our next Prime Minister after Stephen Harper, of course, was Justine Trudeau, 2015 to 2025. And this graph now ends at 2022, but you can see that the trend of federal gross debt per person started to trend up. And then in 2020, you can see that graph, the number just jumped up. Now that graph we've been looking at throughout the video ends at 2022. So I have to change my source of information here now. Now I couldn't find a government debt per person graph, but I have here a just straight government debt graph. But you can see that our total debt jumped from 2020 when it stood at 721 billion. It jumped up, and by 2023, is sitting at about $1.18 trillion and is continuing to move up here. And to do a direct comparison with all the prime ministers we've looked at on this website, and just to reference the numbers we watched from Stephen Harper, where the deficits represented as a percentage of GDP, the worst being minus 3.6%, and then the yearly deficits as a percentage of GDP hovering anywhere between minus 1.5% and minus 1%. We can use this trading economics website that displays the same number for the Justine Trudeau period. And you can see the number started very healthy at minus 0.1%, minus 0.9, minus 0.6, minus 1.7. Yearly deficit as a percentage of GDP. And then, of course, in 2020, where our deficit was almost 15% of the GDP. But you can see that these numbers improved significantly in 2021, 22, and 23. I believe that's the last number on this chart. Our deficit, 1.5% of our GDP, still a little bit too high, and this number needs to come down. But compared to the United States, where their yearly deficits are running at 5 to 6% of their GDP, Canada is in much better shape. But it would be good to continue this downward trend and ideally get these numbers back to 0% of GDP, so that our deficits increase in line with the increase of the GDP of our country. Now you can see there's three main mountains on this graph. They look the same, but they had different reasons. This one that we're dealing with now is a result of massive spending increases that we chose to do due to the pandemic. This mountain here that had to be turned around by Jean Chretien and Paul Martin as the finance minister was also a result of uncontrolled spending with respect to our GDP growth, started by Pierre Trudeau in the mid-1970s, where our spending as a proportion of our GDP just went out of control and was continued out of control during Brian Mulroney's term. This mountain here was a little bit different. It was brought on because of the Second World War, the massive amount of spending that we had to incur and money we had to borrow for the Second World War. But it did not correspond with a financial crisis or poor economy. Economically speaking, the war was beneficial to North America. Our economy was booming. We were manufacturing things. So when the war ended, it was easy for us to get this down. We had a big surge in immigration, so we had more people come to the country, and our economy was booming. So this gross debt per person came down easily. It wasn't very hard for this government to achieve that compared to what Jean Chretien and Paul Martin had to go through. So the question is, where do we go now as we're coming off the top of this mountain? And remember that this data stopped in 2022, and from the numbers we just looked at, it looks like we're coming back down to meet this long-term trend we've been on if you exclude the mountains. What's the right path forward now? And that's going to be the job of our new Prime Minister, Mark Carney. Now, the decisions he makes, the policies he implements, the budgets that his government passes are going to be critical for the long-term prosperity of our country. And you could, hopefully what you learned through our little history lesson there is how important it is to keep things growing in a balanced way. And it's not that hard. It's really just math. You have to budget properly and understand how much is your GDP going to grow, and how much spending you can do, and how much income in the form of taxation you need. You just have to balance those things. And what gets in the way is the politicians' desire to want to do things that are popular, but not necessarily the best things to do for the long-term trajectory so that our economy grows sustainably. For example, just recently, this is the type of thing that politicians are doing more and more of now. There was just an election in Ontario where Doug Ford won, and it just so happened that he came up with a reason right before the election to just mail people money. Even though the Ontario government is running a very large deficit, he just thought it would be a good idea to send everyone money right before the election. Now, is that a good idea for the long-term prosperity and the financial stability of the province? No, but it's very popular and it got him elected. Brian Mulroney made some decisions that were very unpopular at the time, facing stiff opposition, negotiating the first free trade deal with the United States and introducing Canada's first consumption tax in the form of the GST at 7%. Those were very unpopular things to do at the time and probably cut short the potential period he could have served as Prime Minister. Jean Chretien and Paul Martin faced very stiff opposition, and it was very unpopular for them to cut spending and try and balance the budget. Stephen Harper chose to cut the GST, which was very popular and easy for him to do, but was it the best decision? Diametrically opposed to the vision that Brian Mulroney had. And although, of course, that policy was popular, cutting taxes is always popular, one of the long-term effects of that was continuing to widen the gap between the rich and the poor. Because if you go through a detailed analysis of what the effects are of lowering the GST, it disproportionately really benefited rich people as opposed to poor people. For example, if you're really struggling and you're at the lowest levels of income in Canada and all you can afford is food and rent, well, GST is not charged on food and rent. And so a 2% drop in GST for a very poor person doesn't make that much difference. But if you're a very rich person and you're out shopping for a new boat for $250,000, a 2% drop in the GST is going to save you $5,000. Or should he have just left that GST where it was and carefully lowered our income taxes as GDP increased? Would that have been a better plan? Probably, but lowering the GST was very popular. So hopefully Mark Carney makes smart, good decisions and not just decisions that are popular, and that might be difficult in a minority government. So we'll see how it goes. I'm interested in your opinions in the comments section. Leave some comments. Let me know if you learned anything through our little history lesson there. And remember, I did not talk about all the other issues, all the social issues and everything else that was happening in Canada. I just stuck to economics. So as you're probably aware, these videos are very labor intensive. I spend a lot of time researching and finding the numbers and cross-checking the numbers from various sources. So I make sure I'm not just posting stuff that's nonsense, and keep it factual for all of you. So if you appreciate my work, please subscribe to the channel and keep it growing. And thank you in advance to all the people that are sharing my videos and helping the videos get more reach on YouTube. I really appreciate it, everyone. I will catch you on the next one.